Okay, so I'm going to walk you through several of these lectures to help get caught up. This one you have the reading guide for, so you'll need that to go along with the lecture. And you can stop and pause this as needed. The British and the French were both moving into the colony territory. We've already talked about that, and the French began to expand their empire. And they're going to fight over this area called the Ohio River Valley, largely because of money. Beaver skins were highly sought after. The beaver skin trade was making a lot of money. There was great demand in Europe for them. You can see these pretty hats here. The pelt was valuable because it was water resistant. So money. The French began to move into lots of territories. They're going to found the city of Detroit by Antoine Cadillac, a name you may have heard of before. They go through Louisiana, named for King Louis, found the city of New Orleans. And many of the times the natives ended up helping the French because, again, they saw them as lesser threat. Britain has continued this policy of salutary neglect, which we have talked about before. And because the colonies begin to get this idea of we can make rules for ourselves, that's going to help expand the idea of independence and eventually democracy. But the British do realize that they need to control the colonies. So one of the earliest things they do is try to control trade through the Navigation Acts. First of all, they're going to set these rules to say, okay, colonies, you can only trade with us, with Britain. And the main purpose of that was just to keep the French out of the trade. We don't want our enemy gaining anything from the colonies. So good things, shipbuilding increases, all of our ships are protected by the British Navy. Negatives, we don't manufacture a lot of stuff in the colonies because the British want us to buy them their stuff. Because of this also, the farmers or the raw materials get very low prices because there's only one place to sell, that's Britain, so it's the monopoly. But then we have to turn around and pay high prices for their goods that are being manufactured. So we provide the raw material, they provide the finished product. This was, however, very difficult to enforce. A lot of agents did not want to do this or were paid off not to do it. Massachusetts had a lot of smuggling. One of the most famous smugglers who made a lot of money was John Hancock. So we have the establishment of this thing called mercantilism. This is a favorable balance of trade for England. And raw materials, like I said before, are being sent to the mother country. This makes this country self-sufficient. So they live through their colonies to make their country self-sufficient. We don't need to trade with other countries to get stuff. And every colony was affected by this. So there's a war going on in England, in Europe rather, and it spreads into America, just a few places. But this is an example of the animosity between the colonists and the British. One of the forts in Canada that was fought for by a lot of the New Englanders was Fort Louisburg. And they were very happy and pleased with themselves that they had defeated the French and won this fort. But at the peace treaty, this was given back to the French, which made many of the New Englanders very upset. Again, just upset at having the French above them and disgruntled because they felt like they did so much. So this is just a little seed of animosity there. As we move into the Ohio River Valley, Virginia, who claimed a lot of that land, are going to send this young guy named George Washington to get that land. And he's going to attack this fort, Fort Duquesne. The French retreat, return to come back to attack Washington again, who then retreated and built this fort called Fort Necessity. So in a sense, George Washington helped to start this French and Indian War on the continent of North America. There will be a video, this video will be available for you to view on the Dropbox site to show you how this happened. George Washington, as you're going to learn, very, very important for many reasons. He surrendered to the French July 4th, ironically, in 1754. But the big question is, for a lot of historians, is what if George Washington had been killed here or captured, not returned over? He is very, very important to our history, which again you're going to see. It could have changed the whole outcome. We could all be speaking British right now, or German, or whatever. This is Fort Necessity, a recreation in Pennsylvania, current day Pennsylvania. So, French and Indian War, 7 Years' War in England. It was a European war that spilled over to the colonies, over land, and in America it was over the land for beaver skins. Many of the French troops were in Europe, which was good for us, and a lot of the natives ended up supporting the French as well, seeing them as a lesser evil. Not all, but most. So to get all the colonies to work together, the British are going to call for a meeting or a Congress in Albany. And there will also be a video clip that you can view on the Dropbox site. These are things you should have already looked up, what it was, why it failed. What's important is that it was an attempt at unification to keep the Iroquois Indians loyal to Britain and to get the colonies to all work together and agree on this. Very famous cartoon by Ben Franklin. This is often associated with the Revolutionary War, but it actually applied to the Albany Congress because it's saying if these colonies don't all work together, we cannot be successful. So you have information on this as well already. You can review this to see why the colonies were upset. This is the big one. They don't want to give away self-taxation powers. And that'll be another big thing when we start the Revolutionary War. For Britain, the battles did not go very well. The British did not like the colonial militia. They used guerrilla warfare. No, that is not using guerrillas to fight. It's not your classic European style of warfare, and they just looked down upon it. So they had heavy losses. We tried to invade Canada, and that failed. We've always had trouble trying to invade Canada. Never done it. Natives began to make their move. And eventually the tide turns. We have a new commander. He changes tactics. We're not going to go through any of the battles. What's important here is the Treaty of Paris, because the French lost pretty much all their power in America. Spain got control of Louisiana. England claims everything to the Mississippi River. So you can see in this map before and after. France is this color where they controlled this territory. Now this is all British territory. This is another question you should have already looked up. How do the soldiers view each other? There's lots of friction. Nobody recognized any rank above captain in the American militia, even though Washington was a colonel. These are two things that are important, though. The colonists gained experience, and they saw the British could be beaten, which these are things they'll use during the Revolutionary War. Colonies sometimes even traded with the French during this war, so the British were upset about that. You can read this at your own leisure. Unity for the colonies. It's just difficult. There's lots of distance between the colonies, hard to communicate. You had geographic barriers, religious groups didn't like each other, nationalities, all these things. But despite all these differences, eventually that's going to dissipate when they begin to think about independence and the revolution. The natives were in trouble because many had supported the French. They couldn't play the Europeans off of each other anymore. One Indian leader made some brazen attacks and had a lot of success for a short period. Chief Pontiac on the Ohio frontier. And you can see several of these places here in this map. You can study that at your leisure as well. This is an interesting story here. You can read that. King George is the king when a lot of this stuff begins to happen. He's going to be the one that wants to end salutary neglect, to say, hey, colonies, you need to start helping to pay for things like this war we just fought, the French and Indian War, that you started in his eye. George III was called the Mad King eventually. As he got older, he became kind of crazy. Lots of things. He had inherited diseases. One thing was that he would pee purple sometimes. Interesting.
I feel like I'm taking crazy pills!
All right, so you can read through this and make sure you understand how do we pay for these things. The last thing you should have looked up was the Proclamation of 1763, an attempt to keep the colonists under control so they could not move past this imaginary red line to expand, cause trouble with the Indians, or for just control of the colonists. So the British are beginning to pass things and do things to put more controls in salutary neglect against the colonies. And that's the end of that chapter.